Okay, let's talk about the making of modern Iran, which will take us roughly from the dawn of the 20th century up until the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So, prior to 1921, Iran is called Persia, first of all, and it's ruled by the Qajar dynasty, which does enforce a 12er Shia religion on the country. In the early 20th century, though, the Qajar dynasty is definitely in decline, and both the British and the Russians are vying for influence in the region. You can see this lovely little political cartoon from the time, which, from the British perspective, shows the Russians leaning on the Persians, because Russia, of course, is right on Persia's northern border at the time, and of course, the British feel like this is their playground, not Russia's. So this pretty much I think coheres very well with what we've seen so far about colonial competition within the Middle East. That is to say that there is a competition for influence, more as a consequence of trying to limit one another's power than any particular interest in the resources of the area. Yes, oil has been discovered in Iran, but not in such quantities that it's going to make a huge difference. There are some tobacco concessions as well, so Iran is probably one of the more valuable areas in the Middle East, but it's by no means a great prize. It's by no means something that anybody wants to colonize directly, but in as much as Britain wants to limit Russia's influence at all. In fact, the fact that Russia is now communist from 1917 onwards makes it all the more likely that Britain wants to limit Russian influence. But even if they'd not been communist, Britain would still want to limit Russian influence, if only because more power for Russia, more access to resources for Russia, makes England and Great Britain more vulnerable. And so, again, this sort of European state competition that characterizes the 19th century very much continues on into the 20th century in the Middle East. Remember also that after 1922, Britain is going to have some mandates in the Middle East, particularly in the Levant, with Iraq as well as Palestine. Okay. Um, Now, in 1919, Persia becomes a de facto protectorate of the United Kingdom. The Qajar dynasty, I guess, is thinking that Britain is less of a threat than Russia. After all, Britain is very far away, and Russia is right there. Basically, they're using a very similar reasoning that the sheiks on the Arabian coast are using when they're considering whether or not to allow the British bases in the Persian Gulf and on the Red Sea. They're thinking that the Ottoman Empire is very close and that Britain is very far away, and so they seem to be the lesser of two evils. Also in 1919, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the AIOC, gains control of oil fields in Iran, and this will become important later, although at the time it's also considered a fairly important event. Now, right after this, the Soviet Union decides that this is not acceptable, that this treaty with Great Britain threatens their interests, and so they decide to try to weaken Iran by ultimately supporting a revolt in northern Iran, um, in in sort of the Azeri part of Iran, so the part of Iran that um, does not speak Farsi, but is instead is Azeri speaking, which is a Turkic language. And they support the Persian Soviet Socialist Republic of Rasht, a very briefly lived republic. So Azerbaijan and northern Persia fall to the Russians, and Britain tries to help consolidate and defend the regime. Otherwise, During this time, the Qajar dynasty finally falls. Colonel Reza Khan, frustrated by the incompetence of the Qajar dynasty, is a young, ambitious colonel in the army and decides to lead a coup d'etat. And he has the rather unorthodox move to sign a treaty with friendship with Russia. He repudiates the Anglo-Persian agreement, getting Russia to leave, but then betrays the Russians. Your friend Yakub has some fun things to say about that, but basically he plays Russia, he plays off Russia, and ultimately the British ultimately come to accept him as the guy you have to deal with if you want to do business in Iran, and they indeed support his ascension to the throne as Reza Shah Pahlavi in um, in 1925. So let's talk about this Pahlavi guy. First, he's prime minister. Well, first he's a colonel, then he's a prime minister, then he becomes Shah, and he's still a fairly popular figure in modern Iran because he does a very good job of keeping Iran independent from colonial powers and particularly playing off the Russians and the British. He also cemented internal control over the regime. Uh, or I'm sorry, internal control over the country. The Qajar dynasty was kind of weak, and outlying areas weren't really under direct control. But under Reza Shah, you had more centralized control, a more modernizing state, an attempt to reform the state in order to kind of propulse it into the 20th century, in order to play catch up with Europe. In other words, he adopts the French legal code in 1928, so this effectively eliminates Sharia law, making the legal code much more secular than it had been in the past. He launches programs of public education, railroad building campaigns, laws against anything that's not modern, backwardness basically. And he changed the name of Persia to Iran in 1935, so he gives Iran its modern name. But Reza Shah Pahlavi did all of this while creating himself some enemies. And let me just sort of explain the events that led to his fall. He basically took an independent stance from the British and the Russians, which made him very popular domestically. It cemented his local rule and fairly absolute rule at that, because he was so successful at keeping Persia and then Iran out of the control of foreign powers. But of course, like many happened there. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened quite there, but technical difficulties have been, for now, eliminated. So, uh, we were talking about Reza Shah, and we were saying that he had cemented a fairly strong regime domestically because, in part, he resisted foreign power. But of course, this his centralized power led to a certain amount of corruption and a lavish lifestyle. He styled himself very much as an absolute monarch, and this lavishness and perceived corruption in a country that, after all, wasn't so rich, did something to erode his legitimacy. Moreover, his stance against the British and Russians during the 1920s and 1930s led him to become closer to Germany and indeed adopt a lot of technical advisors from Germany. After all, Germany was a potential counterweight to both the British and the Russians, and Germany didn't seem to have any imperial ambitions in Persia. And what so this actually looks a lot like what the Ottomans did with the Kaiser. The British and the French seemed to have designs on the Ottoman Empire, and so that led the Ottomans to seek protection from the Germans, in this case, the Wilhelmine Germany. So these German connections meant that Iran adopted a stance of neutrality in World War II, despite the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, despite the strong ties to Britain. Uh, the Shah allowed German advisors to basically enter the country and remain within the country and still traded with Germany. This neutrality and refusal to expel German technical advisors was a big source of tension with the Allied powers, and in particular, it just wasn't going to be acceptable to the Allies, who, remember, were using this Persian corridor to supply the Soviet Union. Were also relying on the AIOC. The oil reserves now were becoming much more important because of the war effort. Oil was becoming much more scarce, particularly for Great Britain. And so, uh, you know, the the bottom line here is that allowing German operatives in Iran was going to be a big sticking point for the British, and what they basically did was invade the country. Both the British and the Soviet Union invaded the country in 1941, arrested Reza Shah, sent him into exile, and occupied the country for the duration of the war. In order to give some cover of legitimacy to their actions, they ended up putting Mohammed Reza on the throne in September 1941. This is Reza Shah's son. And of course, Mohammed Reza continued to rule right up until the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So let's talk about Mohammed Reza, who also called Reza Pahlavi. He ruled less as an absolute monarch and much more as a constitutional monarch. And let's talk about some of his strengths and weaknesses. One of the problems with Reza Shah was that he had one of the problems with Pahlavi was his lack of internal legitimacy, right? Unlike his father, who had basically seized control from the British and the Russians, had outmaneuvered the British and the Russians, had kept Iran independent. Pahlavi came to power basically as a puppet of the British and the Soviets. And as a result, his regime lacked a certain amount of legitimacy. He was ruling. He didn't have the prestige of his father, and indeed depended on foreign aid to maintain his rule, and that was not seen as particularly glorious or acceptable on the part of the people. And so the country largely was actually ruled by the Majlis. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that in Farsi, but these Majlis are basically constitutional representatives. They're representatives, they're democratic representatives of the people. They were actually created in 1906, but their power fluctuated. They were more powerful, then less powerful, then more powerful. And from 1942 to 1953 in particular, they were very powerful. They had a lot of say in government. They, in fact, ran the government more than the Shah did. Whereas, of course, Pahlavi's father, Reza Shah, very much ruled with an iron fist and didn't listen to the Majlis very much. Now, the important thing to note here is the Majlis were significantly more populist and anti-Western than the monarchy was. So they repealed modernizing laws like laws against failing, and of course they nationalized oil under Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1951, and that was a big problem for the West. Let's talk about this nationalization, because this is a key event, really, in the history of the Middle East as a whole, was the nationalization of the AIOC, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The Majlis, the parliament, is upset that the AIOC will not give Iran a 50-50 deal on the profits from the oil fields. This 50-50 deal was the one that the Saudi Arabians had gotten from the Americans, from Saudi Aramco, and their thinking was, well, we're now no worse than the Saudis, and so we ought to be getting a bigger cut of this pie. And prior, of course, to Aramco getting that deal, Venezuela was the country that started everything off with a threatened nationalization and ultimately a 50-50 deal. Then the Saudis got the deal, and then, of course, the Iranians wanted the deal. So renegotiations of this deal with the British, who seemed to be more intransigent than the Americans, failed. And so in 1951, Mohammed Mossadegh's government nationalized the oil. Mossadegh also did a whole bunch of other things to limit the Shah's power and ultimately reduce his power. They cut the Shah's personal budget. They forbade him from communicating directly with diplomats without a representative of the Majlis present. They transferred royal lands back to the state. They granted the Majlis plenary powers and emergency powers and engaged in widespread land reform, establishing collective and government operated farms. All of this made the Shah's backers, the British and the Americans at this stage, very nervous. It made them very nervous because these things sounded vaguely socialistic, and they were ultimately worried that maybe a revolution would break out. This, at the beginning of the Cold War, was of course going to be unacceptable as much to the British as it was going to be to the Americans. So Operation Ajax in 1953 was the British and the Americans' response to this series of moves on the part of the Iranian parliamentarians, particularly led by Mohammed Mossadegh. And the CIA and the MI6 ultimately conspire with the Shah to get rid of Mossadegh and restore the Shah's powers so that the Shah can rule, can rule on, well, at least in the interests of the British and the Americans. So the CIA ends up giving a lot of money to the Shah to dismiss Mossadegh, which was a constitutional power that he had. But right after dismissing Mossadegh, the Shah flees to Rome and then Paris. And as the Shah is in exile, the CIA tried to engineer a military intervention where Mossadegh is arrested. And of course, the Shah then feels like it's safe enough to return. He returns and rules more autocratically with the support of the military and the British and the Americans. Ultimately, the Majlis' role ended up being curtailed, and order was maintained by a fairly infamous organization called the Savak. And the Savak is the domestic internal police, basically the secret police that would abduct you, torture you, and collect intelligence about you if you were Iranian, and particularly if you looked like you were a dissident. The main dissidents would be the communists initially, the Tudeh party, which was banned, but there was a strong communist movement after the war in Iran. Later, it would of course be the religious authorities, the religious establishment that would be the main dissidents, but both were repressed and were put under surveillance by the Savak. Okay, during the Cold War, the Pahlavi monarchy is actually a staunch U.S. ally. It's one of the only U.S. allies in the region, along with Israel. In fact, Israel and Iran developed fairly close ties at this time. There's a lot of Israelis are wandering around Tehran. There's a lot of cooperation between Israel and Iran at this time. In 1963, the Shah decides, in part with some advice from the United States, to design a reform program to try and diffuse a Red Revolution. The Shah is paranoid. He's very much worried, particularly about communists and left-wing dissidents. He realizes he's not very popular, and he tries to shore up his popularity by essentially giving away land from large landowning elites to rural peasants. Right? He basically does land reforms and a giveaway. It gives everybody their private plots of land. And he tries to create himself a new support basis. Like in many countries, the countryside in Iran is much more conservative than the cities, and so the hope was to sort of shore up support among the conservatives in Iran for the monarchy. Now, what the Shah hadn't counted on was the fact that the conservatives in Iran were going to end up being reactionary. That is to say, they were going to end up being revolutionary, and they were going to end up toppling the regime. Okay, but at this time, the White Revolution, again, it's a series of reform programs, the biggest piece of which is this land reform program, but also privatization of government industry, extending right to vote to women, trying to get companies to share their profits with workers, creating a national pension scheme modeled after U.S. Social Security, also trying to fight against perceived corruption and a renewed focus on literacy and education. Many of these programs would do quite well, but The literacy rate in particular jumped during this period from about 26% of the population to 42% of the population, and the country did see a mini industrial boom. But even if it was a sort of lukewarm economic success, the White Revolution was a political failure. It was designed to preempt a Red Revolution, but it ended up sowing the seeds of an Islamic Revolution. The farmers really were a lot more religiously conservative than the Shah. They were upset about his ties to the West. They were upset about Israel and the alliance with Israel. And they were also upset about some of the progressive reforms. They were upset about giving the right to vote to women. They were upset about a lot of about a lot of sort of related issues. But ultimately, they toppled the Shah, or they allied with the cities to help topple the Shah. So that brings us to the Iranian Revolution, and in subsequent lectures we will discuss the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution.